Johnny Tremaine, Chapter 12, Section 2. Johnny knew he had no chance of leaving Charlestown until the few hundred fresh men who had been rowed over to hold the neck had been withdrawn. Next morning he watched them go and waited his chance. It was 10 o'clock when he left the town. People were running about. Each had a story to tell. Many women, children, and timid folk had spent the night hidden in the clay pits. They, too, were coming out of hiding. Johnny, from sheer high spirits, jumped the now deserted breastwork the British had thrown up so hastily the night before. He had seen so much of the British army, he had come half to believe that they were, even as they said, invincible. No Yankee farmer could stand up to them. He had been impressed with their perfection of equipment, discipline, grand, gaudy, showy uniforms, the pride of their officers. We beat them. We Yankees did. God was with us. He took the road for Cambridge, crossing desolate Charlestown Common with its salt marshes, clay pits, gallows, and gibbet. To clarify what these things are, I had to look them up, because I knew what a gallows was, but I didn't know what a gibbet was. So the gallows, of course, is how you hang people. A gibbet is used to display their dead bodies. So this is pretty dismal. So what we see is that Johnny, right, from sheer high spirits, he's so happy, is passing all these like chunky looking mud pits and then where they hang and display dead bodies. Gross. This is a huge tone shift. Everywhere he saw signs of the retreat, the army pulling back, the heavy tracks of cannon. The road itself began beaten to muck under anxious feet. He saw lost hats, uniforms, muskets even, and he saw a group of men getting a horse out of a pit. The horse was taking the matter sensibly, not struggling, seeming to understand that the oxen being tackled would pull him out. It was Colonel Smith's Sandy. Johnny looked upon this as a good omen, an idea that this would be good luck, and walked forward whistling. But his whistling stopped abruptly. He had met his first burial party. He noted the faces of the men and women following the dead countrymen. Next, he saw a cellar hole with a smoke and stench still rising from it. So we see lots of tone shifting here. Johnny's internal feeling is very upbeat, but all around him is horror. There was a tavern, and in the tap room, men sat about drinking rum and boasting or bragging of their great deeds. Johnny did not doubt, but they all had done as well as they said. But he was in no mood to listen. So having bought bread, a handful of salt alewives, the little fish, and asked if anyone knew where Dr. Warren was, he quickly left. They told him to try Cambridge. Here a strange thing had happened apparently overnight. Milling about were hundreds upon hundreds, perhaps thousands of Minutemen. They had come as they were from the plow, from doing the fields, the shop, even from the pulpit. So the pulpit is where a minister is going to preach from. So, meaning these are farmers, these are shopkeepers, these are even ministers of religion. Most of them had guns in their hands, but there were hardly a dozen overcoats among them. No blankets. Now it's April right now, so in Boston it's still quite cool, and of course it's heading in toward the summer, but at nights it gets quite cold. There was no food except the little their women had tied up for them. Enough to take a man through one day's fighting. No tents, no extra munitions, no extra bullets. What now was to be done with them? What were they to do with themselves? Should they go home now, having accomplished the mission for which they had been summoned? Or were they to stay and undertake the siege of Boston? They had no cannon. Seemingly, they had nothing but the guns in their hands and the fire in their hearts. A man, who told Johnny he was a colonel, he did have a pair of homemade epaulets sewn into his old hunting shirt, said that the Committee of Safety was sitting at the Hastings House trying to work out some way these civilians might be turned into soldiers. Now, I had to look up what are epaulets. Epaulets are basically ornaments added to the shoulders of a garment, of a shirt or a coat, to show that a person has a high military rank. You see it even in civilian life. So these two women are pilots for a commercial airline, and the little ornament that you see on that woman's shoulder indicates that she has a high rank. So this man had sewn epaulets to his ordinary shirt. That would be like me sewing on some fancy sequins to my regular t-shirt. So Dr. Warren was chairman of this committee, this safety committee. Johnny went to the Hastings house where he met Paul Revere, who told him Dr. Warren had left for Lexington. Lexington! It was to Lexington, of all places in the world, Johnny wanted to go. Now he had an excuse for it. This day, like the one before, was warm and beautiful. It was one of those silent, dreamy spring days when sunshine pours down upon the yet cold earth, and the earth turns in its sleep. No cloud in the sky, not one cat's paw of breeze. So this is, again, beautiful. This is a beautiful setting. This is a beautiful description. A tone is very positive. A dreamy spring day. The earth turns in its sleep. It's so lovely. He stepped along rapidly. Not until he reached Menotomy was he once again following the tracks of the defeated British army. A group of folk were standing about a stout old grandame, so she would be a grandma. 6 grenadiers had surrendered to her and asked for her protection. Just imagine that in your mind. This elderly woman and 6 grenadiers, remember, they're like the beefy guys, had surrendered to her and asked this little old lady to protect them. She had no idea the battle was moving in so close. Old Mother Bathrick had been out digging dandelions. She was weeding her garden. In every house left standing, Johnny saw bullet holes and once again a burial party. 12 men, hastily thrown upon an ox sled, so a little wooden sled that would be pulled by large animals called oxen, were being drawn to their single grave. And there were British dead to bury. Where should they be buried? The minister said they were to be laid in the lot set aside for slaves. But all who had hats doffed or took them off as friend and foe passed by. Johnny had no hat, but he stood with bowed head. He walked on. The sight of a young woman drawing water was too much for him. He stopped and asked her for a drink. As he sat on a wall and drank from a wooden bucket, she answered his questions. Was he now in Lexington? Yes, he had just crossed the town line. Those Lexington men, how many were killed on the green yesterday? 8, she said. As he asked his next question, his voice sounded unreal to himself. Happens you know their names? She turned a stony face and stared at him. These are their names, she said. Let them never be forgot. She stretched out her hands and counted on her fingers. Jonathan Harrington, she said, and Caleb, too. Robert Monroe, Jonas Parker, Samuel Headley, Isaac Muzzy, Nathaniel Wyman, John Brown. Rab was not one. Johnny smiled. Now, if you imagine this in your mind, this young woman is pulling up water. She turns her stony face. She's a local. These men are people she knows. And she says all their names. And how does Johnny react? He smiles? Now, if I were her, I'd be pretty grouchy. But apparently she isn't bothered by it. Do you know how the Silsbys fared? She said the women and children had, like so many others, gone away to hide. She believed they had gone to Woburn, but by now they might be back again at Silsby's Cove. And the men went out fighting? Of course. All except Grandsire. He couldn't hide with the women and farm animals, and he couldn't go fight. He was sat on sitting it out under his own roof. Then Johnny went on his way, passing Monroe Tavern, where Percy had joined Colonel Smith. He could see the marks of the cannon and the destruction they caused. So he was in the village. The first thing he noticed as he stood looking down at the green was that the old meeting house had been knocked into a cocked hat by a cannonball. So I want to point this out to you because a meeting house is another name for a church. And traditionally, meeting houses are actually Quaker churches. And what I really want you to understand is that the Quakers are pacifists. The Quakers don't fight. They believe that it is unacceptable to fight. So this is a real ironic situation that a cannonball of war had partly destroyed a meeting house for these pacifists, these people who believe in nonviolence. So we're going to continue on to section 3 because it is also a short section. Section 3. So late in the afternoon of the gentle April day, Johnny came down upon Lexington Green. The smashed meeting house with its tiny wooden belfry was before him. Buckman Tavern was to his right. The green itself was laced over with the shadows of new leaves. It was here the men had stood. Here upon this green they had formed a tiny, pathetic line, a handful of farmers to resist the march of 700 British regulars. Here they had died. Oh, it was so hopeless. and so brave you might laugh and you might cry. The inside of Johnny's nose began to prick, or maybe he started to feel a little emotional, and he brushed his arm across his face. But it was his duty to find Dr. Warren, not to stand gawking or looking at this little battlefield. Thus far, he had had no luck at all in locating the doctor, but at last his luck returned. He recognized his chaise and the little rabbit ear pacing mare of the doctor's hitched before the Harrington house. The doctor was standing on the steps, and about him were a group of women all crying. Jonathan knew why. Jonathan Harrington, wounded in the skirmish, had been able to drag himself thus far to his own house and die upon that threshold. Wow, can you imagine how impactful that would be to have a person you love be shot practically in your front yard and then drag his dying body to die on your doorstep? Dr. Warren was leaving them now. He had on no hat, but a bandage about his thick, fair hair. The bullet had grazed or gone right against his scalp. Johnny went up to him and handed him the lists he had had time to write down during the night at Charlestown. The doctor read it, nodded, and put it in his pocket. He was too tired to say much, but there was one question Johnny had to ask. Dr. Warren, when the Lexington men stood here, and the British over there and fired at them, I know the names of those who were killed, but when the British came back from Concord and the fight went on all the way to Charlestown and the Lexington men went after them, I don't know who was killed then. You are hunting for Rab. Yes, I've got to find him. Nobody seems able to tell me. I'll tell you, Johnny. Tired as he was and surfeited or overwhelmed with the sight of blood and suffering, he broke the news as best he could. Rab stood here, just about where we are standing now. He did not go when Major Pitcairn told them to disperse. Remember, at the end of the previous chapter, he said, "Disperse, ye rebels, disperse." He kept on standing with the other men, his musket in his hands. Johnny could see him. He was picturing him, clear as in the flesh. Rab standing unafraid in the cool gray of earliest dawn, the musket in his hands, the look in his eyes, that fierce, sudden look. But after that, did Rab follow the British to Charlestown? No, he was wounded in that first volley. He got it pretty bad. You mean very bad, don't you? Yes, very. I see. But Johnny saw nothing. The fresh spring world turned black before him. But even in this darkness, he could still see Rab, chin up, shoulders squared, not afraid. Where? He asked. He was carried to Buckman's Tavern. I saw him yesterday. I was about to go there now, but don't expect too much. No. Rab played a man's part. Look that you do the same. I will. He knew that the doctor meant he wasn't to cry or take on. He'd got to take it quietly.